Western Mass News Studios in Springfield. This is Western Mass News, Getting Answers with Dave Mattson.
Thanks for joining me for this week's edition of Western Mass News, Getting Answers. As you know, every week I'm joined by political and business leaders and other newsmakers to talk about the issues that impact you each and every day. And this week, we're getting answers from State Representative Joseph Wagner of Chicopee. Wagner was first elected to the Massachusetts House in 1991 and has been a member of the House leadership since 2001. During that time, he's chaired the legislature's Transportation Committee, the Committee on Election Laws, and now the Joint Committee on Economic Development and Emerging Technologies. Among his many legislative accomplishments are authoring 3 omnibus job creation bills, passing the 2011 Expanded Gaming Act, incorporating a ban on texting while driving into the 2010 Safe Driving Bill, and authoring legislation establishing MassDOT, which created efficiencies by streamlining and unifying transportation agencies. He also serves on the Special Joint Committee on Redistricting. Time permitting, we're going to focus on a more than $3.6 billion spending bill that recently passed the House, redistricting and its impact on Western Mass, and the future of legalized sports betting in Massachusetts. Joe Wagner, good to see you.
Dave, good to see you. And I said walking in, so this is what retirement looks like for you.
This is retirement every Sunday morning when I should be in church. But other than that, Joe, let's start with a $3.65 billion spending bill allocating federal COVID-19 relief funds and surplus state tax revenues. That cleared the House on Friday evening by a vote of 159 to 0. After lawmakers added nearly $174 million in the amendment process. Let's talk about some of the key features of that bill and what it could mean here in Western Mass.
Sure, Dave, I'm happy to do that. So the federal government really has propped up state governments across our nation, and we would be behind the 8 ball without the assistance of federal dollars. There have been a couple of rounds of funding, the most significant being the most recent round of approximately $5.3 billion and another $3.6 or so billion for cities and towns. So my city of Chicopee and the city of Springfield have tens of millions of dollars. In Springfield's case, I think more than 100 million. In the case of Chicopee, somewhere between 35 and 38 million. And those monies are in addition to the monies that the legislature has, which represent about $5.3 billion. So just by way of a brief and quick history, the governor moved to encumber those funds into a special fund, and he proposed ways in which they might be spent. Early on in the pandemic, the legislature, understanding that we needed to act with one voice, got behind the governor as the elected chief executive of the Commonwealth, and we gave him pretty broad discretion and authority for the spending of the early rounds of federal dollars. But we took these, swept them into a fund, all of them, other than $200 million, and determined that we, the legislative body, would determine spending priorities. And some of them look like the governor's, and some are a little bit different. But so what the House did, and I'll add that the Senate will probably today, as we tape, later today, unveil their plan, and will likely take it up next week. And then we hope to get to a resolution by the end of formal sessions on November 17th. But in the House Ways and Means plan, they released a bill which proposed using $2.5 billion of the 5.1 or 5.1 plus, or maybe closer to 5.3, Dave, and we would allocate those across a broad spectrum of policy: healthcare, education, environment, and climate, workforce, and I'll get into some of those in just a moment. But there were 6 categories across a broad spectrum of policy, and we allocated, in most instances across those categories, tens of millions of dollars to communities that were more impacted by COVID versus other communities, underserved communities, communities that didn't have the resources necessarily to deal with the impacts of COVID in terms of services that residents needed. And so we look to balance the scales a little bit. In education, we, for example, in underserved communities, mostly urban communities, we've got $75 million in there for mitigation in schools for air handlers and things like that.
Yeah.
Communities that on our own couldn't do it. And if you don't get that right, it impacts the ability to get students back into school. Hospitals have been taxed. Every couple of weeks, the legislative delegation here in Western Mass, Dave, has a call with hospitals. And you know, the payer mix at Bay State is different than the payer mix at Trinity Mercy or Holyoke Medical Center, where there's more of a public payer part of the equation than there is a private payer. And so hospitals have struggled to keep pace with all that's going on. Workforce, we've all seen this economy will come back very differently. The service industry, restaurants in particular, have been impacted, and I just went to a local restaurant yesterday that was closed. I was surprised it was closed on a Monday, but it was the staffing issues, and they simply cannot staff. People whose employment has been impacted during this period of pandemic haven't wanted to go back to the same jobs that they left. And so we put funds in on the economic development side or in the economic development bucket for skills training, and we're trying to align training and curriculums at community colleges and four-year universities with the needs of employers across this Commonwealth. So that's broadly, you know, I mean, I've drilled down a little bit, but more broadly stated, Dave, what we've really tried to do is take one-time monies, and let me go back, $2.5 billion in ARPA funds, and $1.149 billion in state surplus. So a total of about $3.6 billion. That's the House's proposal. The Senate will unveil theirs today. $500 million into the state's unemployment trust fund to help small businesses. $500 million, $250 million for hospitals, and $250 million for behavioral health. $500 million for frontline workers who showed up every day and worked. Tax relief for small businesses who receive federal funds and had to pay personal income tax on them. We give relief there. So again, across a broad spectrum of policy, and understanding that these are one-time investments, we are trying to use them to build, by some definition, infrastructure, not typical road and bridge infrastructure. Right. And I'd like to just veer off for 1 second. Federal government will do a transportation bill at some point, Dave, and we've got a lot of that ARPA money we're still sitting on, and I think part of the agenda going forward for the remaining $2.8 billion will include some transportation initiatives that we didn't get to this time. But we're trying to build infrastructure and not build these monies into the base of the state budget, and that was the goal.
And it's worked that way so far. You expect the Senate version to be pretty similar to the House?
I think there have been discussions between the House and Senate. It's been reported, and I have no reason to think that it's not being reported accurately, that everyone is in agreement on the $500 million for unemployment assistance to businesses. Because the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund was in effect bankrupt, right. We had to borrow over a 20-year period monies to keep it going, and we assess over a 20-year period upon businesses who pay in the repayment of those funds. So businesses naturally were looking for, they see the money and they're saying, well, how about us? So we led with $500 million. There's agreement with the Senate. That number could move over time, if not in this bill, perhaps in the next bill. I don't want to speak for anyone on that. And we agree with the Senate on the $500 million for impacted frontline workers. So on those areas, there's broad agreement. I think categorically there's probably a lot of agreement as well. Education, housing, I didn't really touch on housing, sure. But economic development, climate, I think those will be in the Senate bill as well, and hospitals and mental health. So
in a short period of time, we're talking, 15 days now to get this through the Senate and to a conference committee, and think get it to the governor, have it signed before you adjourn formally? Yeah, that would be the ideal scenario, and we, although formal sessions conclude on November 17th, we can, in fact, we will meet in informal sessions. That usually is twice a week, and we can move even spending matters in informal sessions so long as there is no objection. A single objection can stop it, but you saw on the House vote it was 159 to nothing. So if there would be no borrowing involved in it, we could move it even after the 17th. Yeah. In a less ideal case, we come into the start of the next calendar year with it and move it then, and use the period between November 17 and early January to dot I's and cross T's. But I think there's been enough discussion on the front end that I am between the branches that I'm hopeful that we might get to something by the 17th. Oh, if only they could do that in Washington. Joe, we have to take a break. Yeah, we aren't going to get into that. Thank you. When we come back, we're going to talk about redistricting and its impact here in Western Mass. Welcome back to Western Mass News Getting Answers. My guest this week is State Representative Joe Wagner of Chicopee. Let's talk about redistricting. This happens usually about every 10 years. It's going to create 33 majority-minority districts in the state. Let's talk about the importance of that.
Sure. This period of pandemic has brought to the forefront on so many fronts issues that societally we face. From budget to social issues, racial issues, inequity, social justice, the division. You made a reference to Congress before the break in a tongue-in-cheek way a little bit, but most people I talk to in Chicopee, the people I represent, they look cynically at their government, and they don't differentiate the federal government from their state government. Right. I do like to think that the political discourse in Massachusetts is a little different than it is on a national level, and I'm not pointing fingers when I say that, and I'm certainly not pointing fingers at our Western Mass congressional representatives, because I think they do a fine job, and I think they conduct themselves really well and account for themselves very, very well. But not everybody does that, and the deep blues and the deep reds, frankly, offend the big, wide, and broad middle. And so many issues have come to the forefront in the most challenging time that I can remember in my 60-plus years in life. And we're going to deal with them for a long time, and there are going to be a lot of books written about it. And so when we come to redistricting, something we do every 10 years based on the state's population, we redraw lines for congressional districts, for governor's council districts, for state senate districts, and for state representative districts. And every state has 2 U.S. senators, so they represent the entirety of a state, so we don't have to do anything on that front. When I came in more than 30 years ago to the Massachusetts House, we had 12 United States representatives in the Congress, and that went to 11 based on population shifts, which really meant that either we lost population and or other areas of the country gained. So you take through a census count across the nation, total population, you divide it by the number of congressional members, and that tells you how many congressional members your state gets. So we went from 12 to 11 to 10 and now to 9. We lost a seat a decade ago. We didn't lose one this time. So how does this look? And it's a long way of getting to an answer to your question. The minority population, the non-white population in the Commonwealth has increased over time. The state population, interestingly, increased 7.4%. And that looks just like the increase at the national level. Mm-hmm. The national population increase was 7.4%. For us in Western Massachusetts, that presented some challenges because the population actually decreased in the 4 western counties when taken collectively. And it increased, but most of that 7.4% increase is in eastern Mass or in other counties in Massachusetts outside of the 4 western counties. So the changing demographic added to that as well, in that the tenets of redistricting require us to look at how we can draw districts where people of similar demographic backgrounds and makeups, communities of color, the idea is to not divide them and to fashion districts that can support the election of minority representatives. And so there are enough areas in the Commonwealth with populations that allow for us to try to do that, and there would be court challenges if we did not try to do that. We have an obligation constitutionally to try to do that. So we go from, in the House of Representatives, the plan that we passed and is now before the governor, 20 majority-minority districts up to 33. And by majority-minority, they are districts that can be won, although aren't always won, by candidates of color. But, and the Senate went from 3 of those districts to 6 of those districts. And so that's sort of, how that goes. Now, we create 5 new districts in Massachusetts with the redrawing of those maps. Okay. 4 of those 5 would be majority-minority districts. Now, whether a person of color wins those districts, one is in Brockton, there's another one in Everett, I believe, Everett might be the center of it, and Brockton would certainly be the center of it. Out here, the Orlando Ramos district.
Right, Northampton, yeah.
Yeah, we reconfigure the lines of that, so that is majority minority. The Holyoke district, Holyoke lost population. For the first time in my time there, Holyoke had to go outside of their borders to pick up population. So Pat Duffy, who represents Holyoke at present, comes into Chicopee and takes a precinct in Chicopee that lines up well with Holyoke. And then the Berkshires, because of population decreases, go from 4 representatives down to 3. And I guess the last thing I would say is that because of population losses in the West and population increases statewide, the representative districts, 160 of them, each have to increase by about 3,000 people. And in Massachusetts, where you've lost population, we're really expanding districts. So the current representatives, Paul Mark and John Barrett, would have to square off against one another under the House plan. But Representative Mark has indicated he's running for the state Senate, and so that makes it
that eases that,
a little less challenging.
Yeah. I remember, because it was 10 years ago when the first congressional district and the second kind of merged together.
Yeah.
And the fact is John Over retired, so it didn't set up that clash between Over and Neal. So.
Yeah, he did, and we had the same thing. We had the same thing 10 years earlier, and it was Bernie Frank who, moved aside. But
so we talk about that. We've redistricted, but one of the other pieces of legislation before you now, the Massachusetts registered voters would be allowed to cast a ballot by mail, and residents would register to vote on Election Day. That's under a sweeping elections bill. How close is that to passing? Because
there's really areas of agreement, substantial areas of agreement. And this is really about dotting I's and crossing T's. I believe we'll get to it. I believe we'll enact something finally. We had a number of executive orders that the governor signed during COVID, and we passed a number of legislative initiatives that either supported those executive orders and were required in order to support those orders, or went hand in hand with those orders. And the governor, most of that expired on June 15th. Most of those expired when the governor said the state of emergency would end. He said June 15th is that date. It was only about 3 weeks prior to the date when he said it. So we had a scramble, and I actually headed up an ad hoc committee in the House where we looked at all of those executive orders and legislative things that we had done. The early voting, the mail-in voting, the absentee voting, all of those things we extended out through this election. I think we'll get to it, and I think we'll codify them statutorily finally.
Seeing that in Massachusetts, where in other parts of the country they're doing away with it. And, I look at the election in 2020 and the fact that we had more people vote than ever before. To me, that's one of those things you'd want to encourage. And in other parts of this country, it's not happening.
Well,
so it's good to see it here.
I'll give you a case in point to that point, okay? The Adam Gomez Senate seat. That seat has been held by someone from West Springfield for as long as I've been in the legislature, well, nearly as long as I've been in the legislature. And it was always a case where if people voted in Springfield was 70% of that district. It's more now under the redrawn Senate district that the Senate unveiled. But the minority of the voting population would vote and decide the fate of the entire district. And Springfield residents, in part because of these early voting and mail-in options, we made it easier for people. The claims of fraud and related things just were not proven anywhere, not only across the nation, but certainly here in Massachusetts. It was well run. The Secretary of State and city and town clerks did a fabulous job and went off without a hitch. And as a result of that, Springfield elected in a Senate district that was already 70% of the district, elected a senator from Springfield.
All right. Joe, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the legalization of sports betting in Massachusetts and lots of other things, too. Welcome back to Western Mass News Getting Answers. I'm pleased to be joined this week by 8th Hampton District State Representative Joe Wagner. The House approved the legislation that would approve sports betting legislation over the summer. Senate seems reluctant to do so. What's the holdup? And do you see anything getting done between now and when things wrap up?
Yeah, they are a little more reluctant to move it, and I guess you'd have to ask them. Back when we enacted into law legalized gaming here in the Commonwealth, we brought an industry online. We created thousands of jobs initially around the construction of the facilities, and now permanent jobs. We realize hundreds of millions of dollars each year in net revenues from gaming. And so when the U.S. Supreme Court determined that the prohibition on sports betting would not be upheld, as it had been for a couple of decades, states moved immediately to enact laws that allowed for sports betting. It seemed like a really good fit here in Massachusetts, given that we had legalized gaming.
Yeah.
And I think it's a different kind of gambler. Nobody has ever been able to put a number to the amount of black market betting that occurs. It's in the billions, but is it tens? Is it hundreds? Nobody really knows. But there's an opportunity here to sort of buttress what we've done with legalized gaming and to expand it to include sports betting. The House has actually taken 2 runs at it. We passed it last year, and we passed it again this year. So at this point, we can do nothing really other than wait and see what the Senate is hoping for. I don't think we'll negotiate against ourselves on it. If they're looking for us to say we'll give it to you in return for, and that's sort of the inside baseball of it, I don't see that happening. So I don't know the reason for their reticence on it, but hopefully we'll get to a common ground. I want to say also I support collegiate betting being part of a bill. We did it. Some of the senators have expressed concern about collegiate athletics, but they're a big piece of this, and there are federal laws that govern what happens if you run afoul of that. So.
Yeah, it is interesting, and because you look at now it's legal in Connecticut, and the fact that Massachusetts was kind of late coming to the table with legalizing gambling. It's like you don't want to be late with this either. So, I hate to say it, but we're out of time.
Well, this has been really fun and enjoyable. Good to see you, Dave.
Good to see you. We'll have you back again.
Appreciate it.
Lots to talk about.
Thank you. Enjoy retirement.
Yeah, well, this is it. My thanks to State Representative Joe Wagner for joining me this week. I'm Dave Mattson. Stay safe, stay well, and if you can, join me next week for Western Mass News Getting Answers.